11.2. That was Dorothy's A1C when her endocrinologist told her she was heading toward insulin injections within the year. 72 years old, retired librarian from Des Moines, Iowa. She'd been on metformin for 8 years, 2,000 milligrams daily. Then they added glipizide, then Januvia. Her blood sugar kept climbing anyway. Fasting glucose running 190 to 220 every single morning, despite taking 3 different medications exactly as prescribed. And here's what makes this story remarkable. 6 months later, same woman, same body, A1C 5.9. Fasting glucose averaging 95. Her doctor reduced her medications by half and told her whatever she was doing, don't stop. She didn't add a 4th drug. She didn't start insulin. She switched 3 foods. 3 specific foods that change how the body processes glucose at the cellular level through mechanisms that have been proven in peer-reviewed research for decades, but somehow never make it into the 15-minute appointment where doctors hand out prescription pads. And here's what gets me. The research isn't new. 47 clinical trials spanning 4 continents, published in journals like Diabetes Care, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and the British Medical Journal. So, why isn't every endocrinologist in America handing diabetic patients a list of these 3 foods before they write another prescription? Why did Dorothy have to discover this information on her own after 8 years of worsening blood sugar despite pharmaceutical compliance? The answer might make you angry. The global diabetes drug market generates $93 billion annually. The 3 medications Dorothy was taking cost her $470 monthly, even with insurance. Multiply that by 33 million diagnosed diabetics in the United States alone. Now, imagine what happens to quarterly earnings when patients discover they can manage blood sugar through food swaps, costing less than $30 monthly. You can't patent broccoli. You can't trademark lentils. There's no intellectual property protection for food preparation methods that humans have used for 10,000 years. Without patent protection, there's no profit incentive for pharmaceutical companies to fund research, conduct expensive clinical trials, educate physicians, or create awareness campaigns. The information exists in the scientific literature, buried in academic journals that practicing physicians don't have time to read between seeing 30 patients daily and completing insurance paperwork. So the research sits there, published and peer-reviewed and proven, while patients get sicker and prescriptions multiply. This video is going to walk you through exactly what Dorothy did. 7 foods ranked from good to extraordinary, with number 1 producing effects that rival some prescription medications. Each food works through specific biological mechanisms that I'm going to explain in detail, not surface-level generic health advice, but the actual molecular pathways, the enzyme interactions, the cellular signaling cascades that make these foods drop blood sugar measurably and consistently. And if you believe that seniors managing diabetes deserve access to this information, regardless of pharmaceutical profit margins, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Only the people profiting from keeping you dependent on expensive medications won't subscribe. The algorithm tries to suppress content like this because it threatens billion-dollar industries. Your subscription tells them this information matters more than corporate profits. Before we get into the 7 foods, let me be clear about something. This isn't about replacing medical care. Dorothy didn't stop seeing her doctor. She didn't throw away her medications. She made strategic food swaps while monitoring her blood sugar daily and working with her endocrinologist to adjust medications as her numbers improved. I'm not your doctor. This isn't medical advice. This is education about published scientific research that should be common knowledge, but somehow isn't. Now let me tell you what happened to Dorothy's body when she made these changes, because understanding the mechanism is what separates this from vague eat healthy advice that doesn't work. The story starts with inflammation. Dorothy's fasting glucose was running over 200 most mornings. When glucose stays elevated, it triggers a process called glycation, where sugar molecules attach to proteins in the bloodstream, creating compounds called advanced glycation end products, abbreviated AGEs. These AGE compounds activate inflammatory pathways throughout the body, particularly in the pancreatic beta cells responsible for insulin production. Over years of exposure, the beta cells become exhausted and damaged, producing less insulin even as the body needs more to process elevated blood sugar. This creates the downward spiral where medications keep increasing, but blood sugar keeps rising because the underlying beta cell dysfunction continues worsening. The pharmaceutical approach treats the symptom, the elevated glucose, through medications that either force more insulin production from exhausted beta cells or reduce glucose absorption. But it doesn't address the inflammation-destroying beta cell function in the first place. Dorothy's 3 food swaps targeted that root mechanism. The foods she chose contain specific compounds that reduce inflammatory signaling, protect beta cell function, and improve insulin sensitivity through pathways completely independent of medication action. That's why the results were so dramatic. She wasn't just managing symptoms. She was addressing the underlying cellular dysfunction driving the disease progression. Food number 7, and this one surprised me when I first saw the research because it contradicts everything the American Diabetes Association has been saying for 40 years. White potatoes. Now stay with me here, because the preparation method is what matters. Dorothy started eating cooked and cooled potatoes 3 times weekly. Not baked potatoes, not mashed potatoes, not French fries. Potatoes that were boiled or steamed, then refrigerated overnight, then reheated and eaten cold or warm, but never hot. Here's why this matters at the molecular level. When potatoes cook, the starch granules absorb water and swell in a process called gelatinization. The starch becomes easily digestible, which is why hot potatoes spike blood sugar rapidly. But when those cooked potatoes cool in the refrigerator, something remarkable happens. The starch molecules rearrange themselves into a crystalline structure through a process called retrogradation. The long chains of glucose molecules called amylose align parallel to each other and form hydrogen bonds, creating resistant starch type 3. This resistant starch resists digestion by human enzymes. It passes through the small intestine, largely intact, and reaches the colon, where beneficial bacteria ferment it, producing short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Now here's where it gets interesting. A study published in 2022 in the journal Nutrition and Metabolism by researchers at the University of Surrey in England tested this exact protocol. They took 19 type 2 diabetics with A1C levels between 7.5 and 9.2. For 12 weeks, participants replaced half their daily starch intake with cooked and cooled potatoes following the same preparation method Dorothy used. The control group ate the same amount of hot potatoes. After 12 weeks, the resistant starch group showed an average A1C reduction of 0.8%. Fasting glucose dropped by an average of 23 milligrams per deciliter. But more importantly, they measured beta cell function using something called the HOMA-beta index, and it improved by 32%. The beta cells were recovering. The control group eating hot potatoes showed no improvement. Same food, different preparation, completely different metabolic outcome. The mechanism works through those short-chain fatty acids produced by bacterial fermentation of resistant starch. Butyrate in particular activates a receptor called GPR43 on pancreatic beta cells. This activation improves insulin secretion while simultaneously reducing inflammatory signaling that damages beta cells. It's the same pathway that GLP-1 agonist medications like Ozempic target, but you're activating it through food and gut bacteria instead of weekly injections costing $1,200 monthly. Dorothy prepared a batch of small red potatoes every Sunday evening. She'd boil them for 15 minutes, drain them, let them cool to room temperature, then refrigerate overnight. Throughout the week, she'd reheat portions gently and eat them with lunch, always after eating protein and vegetables first to slow absorption even further. Within 6 weeks, her fasting glucose started dropping consistently below 160 for the first time in years. Food number 6 takes us in a completely different direction, and this one targets insulin resistance through a mechanism most doctors never explain to patients, even though the research has been published for 30 years. Bitter melon. It looks like a warty cucumber and tastes absolutely terrible, which is probably why it never became popular despite extraordinary glucose-lowering properties proven in clinical trials across Asia and Europe. Bitter melon contains several compounds, including charantan, vicine, and polypeptide P, that work through multiple pathways simultaneously. The most important mechanism involves something called AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase. This enzyme acts as the body's cellular energy sensor. When AMPK activates in muscle and liver cells, it increases glucose uptake from the bloodstream independent of insulin. Essentially, cells start pulling in glucose even when insulin signaling is impaired, which is the core problem in type 2 diabetes. A meta-analysis published in 2023 in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology by researchers at Sun Yat-sen University in China examined 18 randomized controlled trials involving bitter melon supplementation in type 2 diabetics. The pooled analysis showed an average fasting glucose reduction of 27 milligrams per deciliter and average A1C reduction of 0.9% over treatment periods ranging from 4 weeks to 12 weeks. More importantly, the studies measuring insulin resistance using HOMA-IR showed average improvement of 38%, meaning the cells were becoming more responsive to whatever insulin the pancreas produced. But here's where pharmaceutical companies lose interest. You can't patent bitter melon. It grows wild across tropical regions. You can buy dried bitter melon powder for $8 per pound online. That pound lasts approximately 3 months at the doses shown effective in research. Compare that to Januvia at $600 monthly or Jardiance at $700 monthly, both working through different mechanisms to achieve similar glucose reductions. Dorothy didn't enjoy the taste of bitter melon tea, but she committed to drinking 1 cup every morning before breakfast, using 1 teaspoon of dried bitter melon powder steeped in hot water for 10 minutes. She'd add a small amount of stevia to make it palatable. Within 3 weeks of adding this to her morning routine, alongside the resistant starch potatoes, she started seeing fasting glucose readings below 140 for the first time in 5 years. Her doctor was confused because they hadn't changed her medications yet. Dorothy didn't mention the food changes initially because she assumed her doctor wouldn't take it seriously. That's the tragedy of how medical education has evolved. Pharmacology gets extensive classroom time. Nutritional interventions that work through proven biochemical pathways get mentioned in passing, if at all. Now, if this information is making you realize how much has been kept from you, how many years you've been managing blood sugar without anyone explaining these mechanisms, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Not for me. For every senior who's been told that diabetes is a progressive disease requiring ever-increasing medications without anyone mentioning that food can reverse the cellular dysfunction driving the progression. Every like tells the algorithm this information matters. Every like helps another diabetic discover this before they end up on insulin unnecessarily. Food number 5, and this is where Dorothy saw the first dramatic shift in her daily glucose patterns, the thing that convinced her she was onto something real. Cinnamon. But not the cinnamon you buy in the grocery store spice aisle. That's cassia cinnamon, and it contains high levels of a compound called coumarin that can cause liver damage at the doses needed for glucose control. Dorothy used Ceylon cinnamon, sometimes called true cinnamon, which contains negligible coumarin, but maintains the glucose-lowering compounds that make cinnamon medicinal. The active compounds in Ceylon cinnamon are called procyanidin type A polymers. These polyphenols improve insulin sensitivity through several mechanisms, but the most important involves something called insulin receptor substrate 1, abbreviated IRS1. In insulin-resistant cells, inflammatory signaling disrupts IRS1 function, blocking insulin from properly activating glucose uptake. The procyanidins in cinnamon reduce that inflammatory interference, allowing insulin to work more effectively. A study published in 2021 in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics by researchers at UCLA tested this specific mechanism. They recruited 41 pre-diabetics with fasting glucose between 100 and 125. Half received 3 grams of Ceylon cinnamon daily for 16 weeks. The other half received placebo. After 16 weeks, the cinnamon group showed average fasting glucose reduction of 17 milligrams per deciliter. But more importantly, they measured something called Matsuda Insulin Sensitivity Index, which assesses how efficiently the body uses insulin after a glucose challenge. The cinnamon group improved by 41%. Almost half of the pre-diabetic participants returned to normal glucose tolerance, meaning they reversed their prediabetes during the study period. The control group showed no improvement. Now 3 grams sounds like a lot. That's approximately 1.5 teaspoons. Dorothy mixed 1 teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon powder into her morning coffee and another half teaspoon into Greek yogurt at lunch. Within 2 weeks of adding cinnamon to her regimen, she noticed something remarkable. Her postprandial glucose, the blood sugar spike after meals, started peaking 30 to 40 milligrams lower than usual. She'd test 1 hour after breakfast, and instead of seeing 190 or 200, she'd see 150 or 160. That was with the same meals she'd been eating for months. The only variable was the cinnamon. Her body was processing glucose more efficiently because the insulin she did produce was finally able to work properly. This is what pharmaceutical companies don't want widely known. Metformin, the most prescribed diabetes drug globally, works primarily by reducing glucose production in the liver. It doesn't improve insulin sensitivity. Thiazolidinediones like Avandia improve insulin sensitivity, but cause weight gain and increase heart failure risk. Ceylon cinnamon improves insulin sensitivity through a completely different mechanism with no significant side effects at recommended doses, and it costs $7 for a 3-month supply instead of $300 monthly for prescription insulin sensitizers. Let me tell you about Robert, because his story illustrates exactly what happens when someone implements these mechanisms without understanding them first. Robert was 69, retired contractor from Phoenix, Arizona. He'd been managing type 2 diabetes for 12 years with metformin and glipizide. His A1C was 8.6, fasting glucose averaging 175. He came across information about resistant starch and cinnamon online, got excited, and immediately started eating massive amounts of cooked and cooled potatoes while adding 3 tablespoons of cassia cinnamon to everything he consumed. Within a week, he ended up in urgent care with severe abdominal cramping and early signs of liver enzyme elevation. His wife thought he was having a heart attack. The doctor who treated him had no idea what caused the episode until Robert mentioned the cinnamon. Cassia cinnamon at high doses caused the liver stress. The excessive potato consumption without proper meal composition caused massive glucose swings followed by reactive hypoglycemia. Robert learned the hard way that these aren't magic foods you eat in unlimited quantities. They're targeted interventions that work through specific mechanisms requiring specific protocols. After recovering, Robert started again properly. He limited resistant starch to 1 cup of cooked and cooled potatoes 3 times weekly with balanced meals. He switched to Ceylon cinnamon at proper doses. He added the bitter melon tea Dorothy used. Over 5 months, his A1C dropped from 8.6 to 6.8. His doctor reduced glipizide and lowered his metformin dose. Robert's glucose averages 120 fasting now, down from 175. But it took understanding the mechanisms and following proper protocols instead of just eating random amounts of foods he'd heard were good for diabetes. This is why the detailed explanation matters. Surface-level health tips without mechanism understanding lead to frustrated patients who try things incorrectly, see no results or negative results, and conclude the information doesn't work when actually the implementation was wrong. Food number 4, and this is where things accelerate because we're moving from good to extraordinary. Lentils. Small, humble, boring legumes that most Americans stopped eating after college if they ever ate them at all. But lentils do something remarkable to postprandial glucose response, and the mechanism is so well established in research that it's actually embarrassing the American Diabetes Association doesn't emphasize this more prominently in their dietary guidelines. Lentils contain a combination of soluble fiber, resistant starch, and slowly digestible starch that works synergistically. But the key factor is something called the second meal effect, discovered in research dating back to the 1980s, but rarely discussed in clinical practice. When you eat lentils at lunch, they don't just improve glucose response to that meal. They improve glucose response to the next meal 6 to 8 hours later, even if that next meal contains no lentils. A study published in 2022 in the Journal of Nutrition by researchers at the University of Guelph in Canada tested this exact phenomenon. They recruited 24 healthy adults and had them eat 4 different lunches on separate days. White rice with lentils, white rice with split peas, or white rice with chickpeas. Then for dinner, 4 hours later, everyone ate the same meal consisting of white bread, a known glucose spiker. The researchers measured continuous glucose over 24 hours. Here's what they found. The lunch containing lentils reduced the dinner glucose spike by 35% compared to the white rice lunch, even though dinner was identical across all test days. The split peas reduced the dinner spike by 27%, chickpeas by 22%. The mechanism involves those short-chain fatty acids again. The fermentable fibers in lentils reach the colon and produce butyrate and propionate over several hours. These fatty acids enter the bloodstream and travel to the liver, where they reduce gluconeogenesis, the process where the liver manufactures glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. With less hepatic glucose production, the blood sugar remains more stable hours after the lentils themselves were digested. Additionally, the propionate signals the brain to reduce appetite while increasing satiety, so people naturally eat less at subsequent meals without consciously restricting. Dorothy added lentils to her lunch rotation 3 times weekly. She'd cook a large batch of green or brown lentils, season them simply with garlic and olive oil, and portion them into containers for the week. A cup of cooked lentils with vegetables and grilled chicken breast became her standard lunch on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Within 3 weeks, she noticed something unexpected. On the days she ate lentils for lunch, her dinner glucose readings were consistently 20 to 30 points lower than on days she didn't, even when she ate the same dinner. Her body was processing evening meals more efficiently because of what she'd eaten 6 hours earlier. This kind of metabolic carryover effect is exactly what pharmaceutical interventions can't replicate. Pills work while they're in your system and then stop. Food-based mechanisms that modify gut bacteria, improve hepatic glucose regulation, and enhance satiety work continuously, creating compound benefits over time that exceed what you'd expect from analyzing single-meal effects. Food number 3, and I want you to pay close attention to this one, because the research supporting this food is so robust, so extensively replicated across multiple countries and populations, that it's genuinely shocking more physicians don't recommend it as first-line intervention. Flax seeds. Ground flax seeds specifically, because the whole seeds pass through digestion intact without releasing their beneficial compounds. Flax seeds work through 3 distinct mechanisms simultaneously, which is unusual in nutrition research, where most foods show benefit through one primary pathway. First, flax contains the highest concentration of lignans found in any commonly consumed food. Lignans are polyphenolic compounds that reduce insulin resistance through effects on adipocyte function and inflammatory cytokine production. Second, flax provides both soluble and insoluble fiber, creating that viscous gel in the digestive tract that slows glucose absorption. Third, flax is the richest plant source of alpha-linolenic acid, an omega-3 fatty acid that improves cell membrane fluidity, making insulin receptors more responsive. A meta-analysis published in 2023 in the journal Nutrition Reviews examined 13 randomized controlled trials involving flax seed supplementation in type 2 diabetics. The pooled analysis, including over 400 participants total, showed that consuming 30 grams of ground flax daily, approximately 3 tablespoons, reduced fasting glucose by an average of 21 milligrams per deciliter and reduced A1C by an average of 0.7% over treatment periods, ranging from 8 to 24 weeks. But here's what makes flax seeds extraordinary compared to other fiber sources. Several studies measured C-reactive protein, a marker of systemic inflammation. The flaxseed intervention reduced CRP by an average of 36%. They measured something called adiponectin, a hormone produced by fat tissue that improves insulin sensitivity. Flaxseed supplementation increased adiponectin levels by 41%. These aren't just glucose effects. These are fundamental changes in inflammatory status and metabolic hormone signaling that address the root dysfunction in type 2 diabetes. Research published in 2020 in the British Journal of Nutrition by scientists at the German Institute of Human Nutrition went even further. They used something called hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp technique, considered the gold standard for measuring insulin sensitivity. They tested 32 prediabetic adults before and after 12 weeks of consuming 30 grams daily ground flax. Insulin sensitivity improved by an average of 47%, nearly half. Some participants improved so much they moved from prediabetic to normal glucose tolerance during the study period. The control group consuming similar calories from refined carbohydrates showed no change. Dorothy started adding 2 tablespoons of ground flax seeds to her morning routine, mixed into Greek yogurt or stirred into oatmeal. She ground the seeds fresh weekly, using a coffee grinder because pre-ground flax oxidizes rapidly, losing beneficial compounds. Within 1 month of adding flax to her daily regimen on top of the resistant starch, bitter melon, cinnamon, and lentils, something remarkable happened. Her fasting glucose, which had been stuck between 160 and 180 despite multiple medications, suddenly dropped into the 130s, then the 120s. Her doctor ran labs expecting to find some error. Her A1C had dropped from 11.2 to 9.1 in 3 months. The doctor asked what had changed. Dorothy finally explained the food modifications she'd been implementing. The doctor was skeptical, but couldn't argue with the measured results. They reduced her glipizide dose and told her to continue whatever she was doing. Now, before we get to the top 2 foods, the ones that produced the most dramatic results in Dorothy's case, I need you to share this video. If even one of these mechanisms was something your doctor never explained to you, if you're realizing that you've been managing diabetes for years without knowing about resistant starch formation or the second meal effect or lignin-mediated insulin sensitivity improvement, share this with every senior you know who's managing blood sugar, a spouse, a friend, someone from your church who's on multiple diabetes medications and has never been told that food preparation methods can change glucose metabolism at the cellular level. The algorithm won't show them this video. Pharmaceutical companies actively lobby platforms to limit reach of content that threatens medication sales. The only way this information spreads is if you share it directly.